Mishpatim, judgements. God's trumpet call presence. Sixth reading from the book of Exodus. 18th reading from the book of Torah. Outline of Torah portion. Laws concerning slaves. Exodus chapter 21 verse 1 to 11. These are the rulings you are to present to them. Exodus chapter 21 verse 1. Out of the 613 commandments that are given in the Torah, more than 50 of them are found in this Torah portion. First 3 chapters list out various commandments. Last chapter is about how people of Israel consented to keep the commandments that God gave them and how they entered a covenantal relationship with God and the rituals associated with it. God had delivered Israel from slavery from the land of Egypt. They went through severe hardship, but God didn't want them to treat those whom they will hire in the same manner. And He set a higher standard by giving them laws to protect the well-being of the people whom they would hire. These laws were necessary as in that era, slavery was an accepted norm. People lived off the land, and unless one owned land or livestock and wealthy enough to provide for the family, servitude was the only option available for the poor. Most societies didn't have moral standards or rights to protect the slaves. But Torah changed that perception towards slaves. 3 groups of slaves are identified in the Torah: male Israelite slaves, female Israelite slaves, and Gentile slaves. In the first category, there are 2 ways in which a male Israelite might become a slave. First way is if he is convicted of theft in a court of law, he is sentenced to slavery to repay his theft and required to serve 6 years. Second type is where a poor person gives himself over to someone to work to save himself from destitution. If he came single, he is to leave single. If he was married when he came, then wife is to go with him when he leaves. If the master gives him a wife and she bore him sons and daughters, then the wife and the children belong to the master, and he will leave by himself. If the slave does not want to leave, then the master is to bring him before God, and at the door or doorpost, his master is to pierce his ear, and the man will be his slave for life. If a father sells his prepubescent daughter as a slave to a wealthier home as a potential spouse for either the master of the house or for the son of the master, and once the girl is in marriageable age and master or the son decide not to marry her, she is free to return to her father's house. She doesn't have to buy her freedom, and master cannot sell her to someone else. If the master has her marry his son, then he is to treat her like a daughter. If he marries another wife, he is not to reduce her food, clothing, or marital rights. If he fails to provide these 3 things, she is to be given her freedom without having to pay anything. If a Gentile slave chooses to convert to Judaism, then he is no longer a Gentile, and their slave contract changed from a Gentile contract to an Israelite contract, and that person must be released after 7 years. Slavery is still not over with. There is still slavery going on around the world. They too deserve the freedom that we enjoy through Yeshua HaMashiach, And to do so, we need to increase the awareness of the modern day slavery and to find ways to work towards their freedom. The laws concerning violence, Exodus chapter 21, verse 12. Exodus chapter 21, verse 12 to 17 lists 5 transgressions. First 3 are criminal homicide, predetermined murder, and kidnapping. For all 5 transgressions, punishment is death at the hands of a court of laws. If it is not premeditated murder, God will designate a place to which he can flee. Torah says, verse 14, an act of premeditated murder is punishable by death penalty. And in the event of kidnapping, whether the person kidnapped was sold or found still in the possession of the kidnapper, shall surely be put to death. The Torah deems attacking, verse 15, and cursing, verse 17, parents is a grave sin, that it is punishable by death. It does not refer to whether the parent was wounded or killed in the confrontation with the child. We may think this is too exaggerated, but God's standards are higher, and his values are very much higher than ours. God says, honor your father and mother. Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. Yeshua HaMashiach himself said in Mark chapter 7, verse 10, honor your father and your mother. Anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death. According to tradition, this passage is not about using abusive language, but refers to situations where the holy name of the Lord is used to utter an intentional curse against the parents. When we consider laws like this, one can say that Torah is not relevant. In today's context, we might consider family counseling or family therapy in situations like this. There were Torah practicing governments in Israel, but these administrations existed during the kings of Judah. So without a Torah practicing government and without Sanhedrin in the land of Israel, these death penalties are suspended. But what we need to understand is that these laws carry same spiritual weightage. Family is the basic unit of the society. Children must be nurtured within this unit. Primary responsibility of doing so falls on the parents. Children can easily learn from the society. There are far more negative influences than positive influences. Children can easily learn from the society to dishonor, disrespect, to be abusive, ungrateful, unloving, and disobedient towards parents. If you don't want your children to pick up these negative traits, then don't let them socialize with those who behave as such. In 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 5, we are warned to avoid such men as these. Laws concerning animal control and damage, Exodus chapter 21 verse 28 to 32. Torah gives many laws about oxen. Is it relevant to us today? Paul the Apostle asked the question, is it about the oxen that God is concerned? Surely, he says, this is for us. Doesn't he? 1 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 9 to 10, meaning that these laws given are examples and we are to derive broader principles and applications from them. Verse 28. This law illustrates the principle of intent and neglect. An owner of a man killing ox could not be held guilty if the animal had no history of aggression towards people. Yet the animal must die, and the owner forbidden to profit from the animal of its death. If an ox owner had an ox whom he knew to be aggressive and failed to control the animal, he was guilty of murder and punished as such. If the survivors of the dead man accepted monetary restitution in lieu of owner's death, this was an acceptable settlement. If the ox gores a son or gores a daughter, this was treated as a death of a minor, regarded as people with rights to respect as well as adults. If the ox gores a male or female servant, the price of restitution was 30 shekels of silver. The price of a slave. Slave was still a human being. His blood brings blood guilt, like that of any other human being. Significantly, Yeshua HaMashiach was sold for 30 shekels of silver when Judah betrayed him. Verse 33. If a man opens or digs a pit, does not cover it, and an ox or donkey falls in it, money will be given to the owner, but dead animal will be his. These laws communicate the principle of responsibility for the consequence of an individual's action upon another. If one man's ox hurts another's so that it dies, sell the live ox and divide the money from it. These laws required the investigation and an analysis of judges so that application of the law considered findings of intent and negligence. Laws of restitution and compensation. Exodus chapter 22 verse 1 to 31. Most of the legislation in the Torah, Old Testament laws given to Israel through Moshe, especially those laws regarding restitution and court-imposed penalties, is based on a justice system known as measure for measure. In Latin, lex talionis, law of retaliation. Its principle is exact equivalence. The punishment was supposed to mirror the crime. On the surface, it seems barbaric and outdated. The law of eye for an eye is usually understood to mean inflict identical physical injury in retaliation for a physical injury suffered. This type of thinking or understanding makes it difficult to comprehend the law of love Yeshua HaMashiach taught. You have heard that our fathers were told, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you not to stand up against someone who does you wrong. On the contrary, if someone hits you on the right cheek, let him hit you on the left cheek too. If someone wants to sue you for your shirt, let him have your coat as well. And if a soldier forces you to carry his pack for 1 mile, carry it for 2. When someone asks you for something, give it to him. When someone wants to borrow something from you, lend it to him. Matthew chapter 5 verse 38 to 42. Yeshua HaMashiach's teaching was to resist the temptation to take personal revenge. He was correcting the interpretation of the law of measure for measure. What he was teaching was not to use the opportunity to take vengeance or settle scores. That is, not to misuse the law to justify own personal vendettas. The law of measure for measure is a rule how a court of law should assign damages and restitution. Neither he was suggesting that a court of law should drop the standard of measure for measure. In fact, the law warned against personal hatred. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly so that you will not share in their guilt. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 17 to 18. The law of measure for measure is all about monetary compensation and not physical compensation. According to Rashi, eye for eye concept is about financial remuneration. If a man blinded another man's eye, he must pay the man the value of his eye. So too with all other damages. Justice for all. Exodus chapter 23 verse 1 to 9. Exodus chapter 23 verse 1 to 3 gives commands to respect laws and not convenience or the opinion of the crowd. The only way not to circulate a false report, a rumor, is to ask and require proof from the person bringing the report. According to Deuteronomy chapter 19 verse 15, the proof must be from 2 or 3 witnesses. Commandment not to join hands with the wicked by offering perjured testimony, that is, not to be an unrighteous witness, because in a charge of violence a verdict will be fatal to the defendant. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil. Nature of man has always been to follow a crowd to do evil. It's a commandment not to follow peer pressure and popular opinion. By doing so, if it promotes a false report and prevents justice, then it is a sin. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 33 warns us to be careful of evil company. And it is important to choose the crowd we move with carefully. Torah commands not to show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. Poor were not to be favored just because they were poor, or rich should not be favored because they are rich. The facts and principles of justice should decide a dispute. Exodus chapter 23 verse 4 to 9 gives laws promoting kindness and righteous civil conduct. How one feels about someone does not determine right and wrong behavior towards them. They are principles of justice and must be observed above feelings. Torah command that we treat our enemy, the legal adversary, like any other neighbor. It is easy for the poor to get neglected in receiving justice. The idea is that one should get a fair hearing and justice. Torah commands to keep far from false matters, not to kill the innocent and righteous, not to take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. Fairness and kindness were commanded even to the one who hates you. Even as Yeshua HaMashiach taught in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Luke chapter 10 verse 30 to 37. Torah commands not to oppress foreigners, for you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. He summed up all these laws by commanding, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Luke chapter 10 verse 27. Sabbatical year and Shabbat. Exodus chapter 23 verse 10. For 6 years you are to sow your land with seed and gather in its harvest. But the 7th year you are to let it rest and lie fallow. Exodus chapter 23 verse 10. The principle of Sabbath applied to more than the work week. There were also Sabbath years. On the Sabbath year, the land was to rest and lie fallow. The law of sabbatical year was unique in the world and only associated with Israel. One reason God gave the Sabbath year is to give poor people the opportunity to harvest and process that which grew from the fallow ground. Israel failing to give the land its Sabbath years determined the certainty and duration of the Babylonian exile. Leviticus chapter 26 verse 32 to 35. True Chronicles 36 verse 21. The Shabbat rest is intended for all people, even the animals. Sabbath was to be dedicated to the Lord God and not to any foreign or false gods. Torah says not to invoke the names of other gods or even let their names be heard. The annual festivals, Exodus chapter 23 verses 14 to verses 19. 3 times a year you are to observe a festival for me. Exodus chapter 23 verse 14. Adonai commanded that 3 times a year all men in Israel to come together to keep 3 festivals. These 3 festivals are Feast of the Unleavened Bread, Passover, Feast of the First Fruit, Pentecost, and Feast of the Ingathering, Tabernacles. These 3 festivals are also known as pilgrim festivals of the Lord. Exodus chapter 14 to 19, Exodus chapter 34 verse 18 to 23, and Deuteronomy chapter 16 1 to 17. In Leviticus chapter 23, these feasts are the Lord's feast for all people and must come together on these days to have a holy meeting. Within the 3 pilgrimage festivals are other feasts, total of 7 feasts of the Lord. You are not to offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, nor is the fat of my festival to remain all night until morning. Exodus chapter 23 verse 18. Leaven was a symbol of sin and corruption. Atoning blood could never be offered with leavened bread. Atonement must be complete work, must be wholly offered to the Lord, not a portion reserved for later. Fat of my sacrifice, the best portion of the sacrificed animal. You are to bring the best first fruits of your land into the house of Adonai your God. Giving God the first and the best honored him as the good provider for all things. You are not to boil a young animal in its mother's milk. This law was to instill a gentle appreciation of the natural order. The conquest of the promised land, Exodus chapter 23 verse 20 to 33. But if you listen to what he says and do everything I tell you, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and a foe to your foes. Exodus chapter 23 verse 22. Adonai promised that he will send an angel ahead of the people of Israel to guard them and bring them to the place he had prepared for them. They were instructed to pay attention, listen to him, and not to rebel against him. He will not forgive any wrongdoings, for Adonai's name resides in him. Obedience to Adonai will bring them victory. One of the specific instructions given to them was that not to worship the gods of the lands they conquer, serve them, or follow their practices. Rather, demolish completely and smash their standing stones to pieces. You are to serve Adonai your God. He will bless your food and water and will take sickness away from you. Women will not miscarry or be barren, and you will live out the full span of your lives. Adonai promised to send terror of him ahead of the people of Israel, and the enemies will turn their back on them. He said he will drive out the enemy gradually until they were grown in number and can take possession of the land, so that the land will not be desolate and the wild animals will not be too many to handle. Adonai said, I will set your boundaries from the sea of Surf to the sea of the Philistine, and from the desert to the Euphrates River. Adonai further instructed for them not to make a covenant with the people of the land or serve their gods. He instructed, drive them out of the land, otherwise they will make you sin against me by ensnaring you to serve their gods. The blood of the covenant, Exodus chapter 24, verse 1 to 8. Moshe came and told the people everything Adonai had said, including all the rulings. The people answered with one voice, we will obey every word Adonai has spoken. Exodus chapter 24, verse 3. God spoke to Moshe alone in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2 to verse 33. Now others were permitted to come up to the mountain, but keep their distance and worship from far. Moshe had special access to God. But God spoke to him, he spoke to the nation in return. When people heard the law of God, they responded with one voice. They verbally agreed to obey the Lord. Then Moshe wrote all the words of the Lord on a scroll. God's word is important and cannot be left up to human recollection and had to be written down. Commitment to writing was an important part of the ratification process. By writing the terms of the covenant, Moshe made it into a legal reality. Moshe built an altar at the base of the mountain and set upright 12 large stones to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Moshe sent young men of the people of Israel to offer burnt offerings and sacrifice peace offerings of oxen to Adonai. He took half the blood and put it in basins. The other half he splashed against the altar. He took the book of the covenant and read it aloud for the people to hear. And they responded, everything that Adonai has spoken we will do and obey. Moshe sprinkled the sacrificial blood on the people and said, this is the blood of the covenant which Adonai has made with you in accordance with all these words. Marking both parties with the sacrificial blood indicates the responsibility of both parties in keeping the covenant. God would never fail, but people of Israel would have problems holding up their end of the covenant. Yeshua HaMashiach at his last Seder with his disciples took the cup and said, this cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. Luke chapter 22 verse 20. On the mountain with God, Exodus chapter 24 verse 9 to verse 18. Moshe, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 of the leaders went up, and they saw God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a sapphire stone pavement, as clear as sky itself. Exodus chapter 24 verse 9 to 10. What they saw suggests that they saw the footstool of God. They saw some aspect of a heavenly vision of God, a glorious experience, but was not a face-to-face encounter. The elders of Israel could see God, but there was no communication between them and God. God permitted the elders of Israel to experience this spectacular vision to impress in them the reality of God's presence. So, they will be able to trust God when he speaks through Moshe. They brought food from the sacrifices with them. So 74 men were gathered around the manifested presence of God. And in God's presence they ate and drank. A shared meal was a common way of sealing a covenant. Adonai told Moshe to come up on the mountain to give the stone tablets with the Torah and the mitzvot Adonai had written on them, so that Moshe can teach the people. People of Israel were assembled at the foot of the mountain. Aaron and his sons and the 70 elders of Israel were halfway up the mountain. Moshe and Yehoshua went up further on the mountain, but Moshe alone met with God. And the cloud covered the mountain for 6 days. The glory of Adonai stayed on Mountain Sinai. On the 7th day, he called to Moshe out of the cloud. Moshe was on the mountain for 40 days and nights. People of Israel couldn't see Adonai or Moshe, but they saw glory of Adonai like a raging fire on the top of the mountain.